Good afternoon, everyone. Lovely to see you all here on this gorgeous spring afternoon. Welcome to the Historical Presidency Lecture Series. My name is Will Hitchcock, and I serve as the Director of Research and Scholarship here at the Miller Center. Today is a great day for the Miller Center. First, we're hosting our spring meetings of our Governing Council, and that means that many friends of the Center are here in the forum room at this lecture, and it's just wonderful to have them here and to be part of today, and we're enjoying their presence here at the Miller Center over the course of a day and a half of meetings. But it's also a good day because we have up here on the platform two of the finest historians now working in the United States, Gary Gallagher and Alan Taylor, both of whom I'm very pleased to say are members of the Corcoran History Department right here at the University of Virginia. Now, let me just give you a quick word on this. Those of you who are new to this, here's the format. Alan Taylor is going to speak for 35, 40 minutes. Then he's going to sit together with Gary Gallagher, and they are going to engage in a conversation about some of the points that Alan will have made in his talk. And that will go on for about 15 minutes, and then we will take some questions from the floor. And if you want to be thinking ahead about your question, that's a good idea, and then you can make your way to the back of the room and use the standing microphone at the back of the room to deliver your question. And those of you in the middle, it'll take a few moments for you to get out to the edges. That's all right, but you do have to go back to the back of the room. Now, of course, today's going to be, the spotlight will be on our speaker, Alan Taylor, and for good reason. But before we turn the spotlight on Alan Taylor, I just want to make sure the spotlight is on Gary Gallagher for just one moment. He hates this. He doesn't like introductions. I'm not going to give him one. I just want to say this.
Stop.
Oh, stop. No, I didn't. I'm not going to give you an introduction, but I am going to say some nice things, which is just that Gary joined the Miller Center this year as a faculty associate, senior associate here. He's been a wonderful addition to the Miller Center, to its academic work and its programs. He's lectured here at the Center a number of times. He gave a terrific forum with Doug Blackman and the American Forum program on the enduring importance of the Civil War in American history and thinking about American history. And he took the lead and put this lecture series together on the American presidency and the crises of the 19th century. What Gary did was he said, you know, there is a whole 19th century out there that you students of the presidency might want to take seriously. And we did. And the result has been a terrific series that we've had this year. Gary will talk a little bit more about that. So without further ado, I want to introduce the John Now Professor of Civil War History, Gary Gallagher.
Thank you, Will. And Will is absolutely right. The 19th century is a very fine century, and it's good to have you all here to recognize that it is. I won't make invidious comparisons between it and any of the less important centuries that nestle before and after it in the narrative of our national past. I've gotten to do this 6 times this year, this academic year, and it's been great fun every time. Began with Jim McPherson and me talking about Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis as commanders-in-chief during the American Civil War. Then we got to hear Dan Howe talk about James K. Polk and the presidency during the war with Spain. Bill Brands talked about Andrew Jackson. Mike Holt, who is sitting here in the front, got to talk about the titans of the 1850s, Franklin Pierce and James Buchanan. Joan Waugh talked about U.S. Grant and Reconstruction last month for our 5th talk, and this afternoon I'm delighted to be able to introduce Alan Taylor as our 6th and final presenter. I feel like having Alan join the Department of History at the University of Virginia is like hearing in about 1957 that your team just traded for Mickey Mantle. You got him at the peak of his power, and he's going to make a very big difference for your team. Alan also hates flowery introductions, and I'm going to respect that sort of. He's the Thomas Jefferson Memorial Foundation Professor of History at the University of Virginia now. He has spent a good part of his career at the University of California, Davis, where he held a distinguished professorship. He's a specialist in colonial and revolutionary and early republic history, and he has published numerous award-winning books. I'm only going to mention 4. I'll start with William Cooperstown, Power and Persuasion on the Frontier of the Early American Republic, which Knopf published in 1995 and which in 1996 won the Pulitzer Prize for History, won the Bancroft Prize, and won the Albert J. Beveridge Award. which is quite a trifecta for those of you who have a sense of these things. The Divided Ground, Indian Settlers in the Northern Borderland of the American Revolution came out also from Knopf in 2006 and won the major book prize of the Society of Historians of the Early Republic. The Civil War of 1812, American Citizens, British Subjects, Irish Rebels, and Indian Allies, also Knopf, 2010. I taught that book in my military history class this semester very effectively. Was a finalist for the George Washington Prize. And most recently, The Internal Enemy, Slavery and War in Virginia, 1772 to 1832, published by Norton last year, was a finalist for the National Book Award in Nonfiction this year and won for a second time for Allen the Pulitzer Prize in History. Just learned about that very recently. I hope you will join me in welcoming Allen to speak about James Madison and the brink of national ruin. Allen?
Thank you, Gary, for that very kind introduction, but as a Red Sox fan, I didn't get the analogy with Mickey Mantle.
I did that.
Did you? Well, you are a cruel man. I also want to thank Governor Beliles and the Governing Council for hosting and attending this event. This is a great pleasure for me to be here at the Miller Center and to be joining the faculty at UVA. So I have many debts. I'm grateful to Dean Meredith Wu for her part in helping to arrange that, and to my colleagues. My colleague John Stagg, who is a great leader in the scholarship on Madison. His work is absolutely indispensable to what I know about Madison. To Gary, it's one of the great pleasures of joining the faculty is to become Gary's colleague. And to Will Hitchcock for helping to arrange this, and I am very much looking forward to being his colleague as well. So I want to begin with a few slides about the War of 1812, which was one of our least remembered wars. It looms very small in American memory. And the standard line is that it didn't make a difference, so why bother with it? My friend Brian Ballig interviewed me for the Backstory program on a book that I'd done about the War of 1812. And after the interview, he said to me, quote, only you could make the War of 1812 interesting. Now, I think that was a compliment, but the implication is only you would bother to try to make the War of 1812 interesting. Now, I'm going to try to make it interesting tonight. I would say that if Americans do recall the war, it's for a handful of patriotic episodes pulled out of context. So, for example, Americans may know about the naval victories of the warship that we call Old Ironsides. Or on a nastier note, what the British did when they got into Washington, D.C. and burned the public buildings, especially the White House. And this tends to come up every time a British Prime Minister visits the White House. Now, on a happier note for Americans, just a couple of weeks later, the British attacked Baltimore and suffered a very great defeat. And this is primarily remembered because of the song written about it, which has become the United States national anthem. Or the most sensational victory won by the United States during the war, which was Andrew Jackson's great victory at New Orleans in January of 1815. Now, with the exception of the unfortunate business at Washington, the events that we do remember from the war tend to be American victories and the successful defense of the homeland against British invasion. So if people do have a memory of the War of 1812, it's as a feel-good story, which I want to ruin for you tonight. Okay? Or at least I'm going to spend most of my time ruining it for you, and then at the end I'll bring you back and you can feel somewhat good about it. The last year of the war was one of the most disastrous periods in American history. if we look at the period from the end of the American Revolution until the coming of the Civil War, a period of 73 years, this period is the most disastrous set of circumstances, and the period when the United States comes closest to failing. In January of 1815, the Richmond Enquirer, which was one of the leading newspapers in the country, described the United States as dissolving under the pressures of a disastrous and divisive war. Quote, "In the northern and eastern states, rebellion and civil war stare you in the face. The people generally are losing confidence in the energy of the government. They are suffering, they are bleeding under the pressure and calamities of war. The militia, dragged suddenly into service without preparation, unaccustomed to the hardships of the camp, pining after their homes and their families, are dying by hundreds with disease. On the Atlantic frontier, the enemy are making inroads into our country, burning our towns, villages, and hamlets, plundering the people," end quote. And this comes from a pro-war, pro-administration newspaper. The opposition Federalist newspaper said far worse. The nation's fourth president, he's the Madison on the left, served during the worst crisis endured by the United States, short of the Civil War. At no other time in that span did the United States lose its national capital to foreign invasion, looting, and partial destruction. In addition, the nation faced imminent bankruptcy for want of the credit to finance its mounting debts and annual expenditures. In late 1814, the Union also came close to blowing apart, as 3 New England states laid the groundwork for secession if the war lasted into the spring of 1815. In December 1814, the Virginia Adjutant General grimly predicted that without a miracle, quote, "this union is inevitably dissolved," end quote. Now, this crisis derived from a reckless war declared by the United States, by the President and Congress in June of 1812. The United States lacked a sufficient army and navy and tax revenues to take on the most powerful naval power in the world, Great Britain. They declared war because they felt there was no alternative to national humiliation. And the primary set of issues that concerned them involved what they saw as the maritime rights of the United States. The British Navy was engaged in a global war against Napoleon. And Napoleon's French Empire was waxing powerful, and things weren't looking all that great for the British Empire in the first decade of the 19th century. And Britain's great hope lay in its navy. But Britain is a relatively small country, and to maintain a massive navy meant that they needed every possible able-bodied man. But they were losing thousands of sailors who were leaving the British Isles to go to the United States, where pay and other conditions were so much better for sailors. The British response to this was to stop American sailing ships on the high seas or coming into European ports, to prevent them from trading with any French-occupied port, but also to inspect their crews and to remove anyone who could be plausibly cast as a former British subject. In the process of doing this, they made many mistakes, some intentional, by taking many who were American citizens. This struck American political leaders who came from the Republican Party, not today's Republican Party, but the Republican Party of Jefferson and Madison. It struck those leaders as reducing the United States to a quasi-colonial status if the American flag did not protect the sailors on their ships from this sort of interference. Now, in the image that you see here, it's a highly ideological image. It's conveying the Republican perspective. It shows a heroic sailor being crowned by Lady Liberty. In the background, there is an American fighting warship. And in the foreground, under the foot of the sailor, you can see that he's trampling on a crown and a set of chains. And the motto is, "We owe allegiance to no crown." This is a message that the American Republic is a distinctive society in the world, a world dominated by monarchies and aristocracies, but that the Republic must defend the freedom of its citizens in order to be successful as a republic. Now, the British refused to compromise because they felt they could not afford to compromise on what they considered to be their maritime rights to police the oceans of the world, given their superior maritime power. And when the British didn't back down, the Republicans felt there was no alternative to war. A Republican worried that if Congress backed away, quote, "I think our doom will be fixed and we shall become the tame, submissive vassals of Britain and a laughing stock to the world. And then we may bid a long farewell to liberty and equal laws." Quote. Now, this is a highly political war, and the Republicans are waging this war in part to shatter the Federalist opposition. They want to exclude the Federalists from participating in the war, and they hope that a successful war would discredit the Federalists because of their opposition to it. We often hear today pundits lament the polarization of our national politics as unprecedented. They know very little about the early republic, when neither party accepted the legitimacy of the other, and instead tended, under duress, to treat their opponents as crypto traders. The War of 1812 brought that rhetorical hatred to a boil, as the Republicans hoped not simply to defeat the British, but also to utterly and permanently discredit the Federalists. Seeing the political trap, the Federalists worked to subvert the war effort by discouraging enlistments, refusing loans, smuggling with the enemy, and some of them even spied for the foe. Now, the best chance for an American victory came in the first 2 years of the war in 1812 and 1813, when most British forces were tied down in Europe fighting against Napoleon at the peak of his power. And the United States primarily waged this war by invading Canada, then a set of British provinces. But these invasions were thoroughly botched and reaped a set of humiliating defeats, including the one depicted here at Queenston Heights in October of 1812. This may look like a satirical drawing, but this is an actual photograph of American forces involved in the War of 1812. Or it could be, if it wasn't a satirical drawing. So the creator of this image is trying to partially explain why American forces efforts went so badly in this war. And they're raw troops. This is a military that had been starved for men and money for many years before 1812. They're trying to build it up overnight. They're having very poor luck encouraging Americans to enlist in this, and everything that possibly could go wrong did go wrong. And troops were literally sent to the front, they were given guns, and they had no training. And then they are put into combat with officers like this man, who is just trying to figure out what a map is. The leaders of American forces were about the most miserable set that you could imagine. Many of them were too old for service, or they were people who were without experience commanding anything larger than a company. So the invasions are going very badly. And then the war gets even worse because Napoleon is crushed in Europe in the course of 1813 and 1814, and that frees up thousands of troops, British troops, who are able to cross the Atlantic and transform the nature of the war in the last year. Here's an overview of North America, and you can see that the dark brown areas are areas in which American citizens dwelled, and most of the continent is still in native possession. The British were to the north, British North America, what we now call Canada. And during the second half of 1814, the British are in a position to take the war against the United States in several offensives. One proceeded from the vicinity of Montreal and went south and struck toward Plattsburgh, New York. A second major operation occupied eastern Maine without significant opposition. A third force went into Chesapeake Bay, and you know how that turned out. And then a fourth proceeded against New Orleans. And the point of all of these attacks is to stress the United States. Now, some British military commanders hoped to stress the United States to the breaking point, where perhaps the Union would unravel. Now, the most humiliating of these attacks for the United States is the one that captures Washington, D.C. The British occupation was brief. It was for only 2 days. They succeeded in getting in because just about all of the American regular troops had been posted along the Canadian frontier. And so the defense of Washington fell primarily to District of Columbia and Maryland militiamen, who were just not cut out for fighting against regular British troops. And so the British were able to push them aside at Bladensburg and then get into Washington, D.C. And they burned, here is the White House, and it's among the many buildings that they destroyed in the city. The British did withdraw after 2 days and went back to their ships. Their point was not permanently to occupy, but to deliver the message that the Madison administration could not defend its own capital. In the silver lining department, Madison proved active and conspicuous in restoring order and confidence among the panic-stricken people of the district when he returned there a day after the British evacuation. The crisis provoked an upheaval in the president's cabinet. Madison pressured the Secretary of War, John Armstrong, to resign as an apt scapegoat for the British triumph. Thereafter, James Monroe did double duty as head of both the Secretary of State, of the Department of State and of the Department of War. Meanwhile, the able but exasperated Secretary of the Navy resigned, and so did the overmatched Secretary of the Treasury. In late 1814, the federal government was on the brink of bankruptcy. In December, the new Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander J. Dallas, grimly reported that to fund the war for another year, the government needed $56 million. Now, I know that sounds funny now. This is like the Austin Powers thing, where Dr. Evil demands $1 million. And it seems funny because our sums are so inflated. But $56 million is serious money in 1814. It's 3 times the anticipated national revenue. Only loans could bridge the gap. But the Federalists weren't loaning any money, and the apolitical financiers had decided that the war was endless and fruitless, and so they weren't going to loan the administration any more money. Without money, the United States could not continue to pay its troops, could not even pay to track down deserters, and certainly could not pay the bounties that were necessary to entice young men to enlist in the American forces. In early 1815, Monroe calculated that the United States Army had 40,000 men in it, but that it would need 100,000 men to continue the war. Where is it going to get another 60,000? He proposed conscription. This is the first time in American history that conscription was proposed to Congress, and it went down in flames because the congressmen didn't dare impose this on the American public, despite the military disasters that they were experiencing. And then the nation nearly came apart. The New England states were those states where the Federalists were strongest. They were completely alienated from the war. They felt that it had been waged in order to punish New England. And so they whipped up many of their constituents to a belief that the only safety for them would lie in seceding from the Union. The governor of Massachusetts sent a secret emissary in the fall of 1814 to the British governor of Nova Scotia to sound them out on a military alliance should the New England states leave the Union. Meanwhile, delegates, official delegates from 3 of the New England states and unofficial delegates from 2 other states gathered in Hartford, Connecticut for a secret convention. Republicans expected the worst. Madison directed the redistribution of American military forces, moving 1,000 soldiers to Greenbush, New York, very near Massachusetts' western line, in order to be prepared if there was secession to rush them into New England, and in particular to secure the federal armory at Springfield, Massachusetts. Preparations were also underway to raise Republican volunteers within New England to wage a civil war within that region. Colonel Thomas Sidney Jessup was sent to Hartford ostensibly to raise troops, but really to be an American military observer of the Hartford Convention, to be prepared in case there was secession announced. But the delegates to the convention were cautious men, and they settled for halfway measures. They decided they were not prepared to secede in December of 1814. Instead, they issued a set of demands that the New England states should be able to cease paying taxes to the United States, but should instead be able to take those monies and conduct their own defense, free from the United States. They also proposed 7 amendments to the U.S. Constitution. The thrust of them was to reduce the political rights of immigrants in the country, because immigrants were understood to be primarily Republican voters, and to reduce the power of Virginia by forbidding any state to send consecutive presidents to the presidency. Now, as you can well imagine, these proposals are not going to go anywhere with the Republican-dominated Congress or with the Republican administration. And these delegates know that these proposals are dead on arrival. But the point of them is for them to be rejected, because they have scheduled a new convention that would meet in June of 1815. So they are being prepared for the war to go on, for the war to continue to be disastrous, for their constituents to be even more fed up. And then they could cite that they tried to compromise and it was rejected by the Madison administration and Congress. So if the war had gone on until June of 1815, I think it's safe to predict that there would have been a secession crisis. And Republican leaders were despairing. The Attorney General, Richard Rush, lamented that the nation was fighting, quote, "for nothing but disaster and defeat, and I dread to add disgrace. The prospect looks black. It is awful." A Virginia officer lamented, quote, "the prospects of the country are melancholy beyond all former example, a divided people, a feeble Congress, and an administration of very little efficiency," end quote. The last best hope they had was that ongoing peace negotiations in Ghent would lead to a successful resolution of the war. But the news they got in the fall of 1814 only added to their despair, because British demands were of major territorial concessions from the United States. Reports of this impasse at Ghent deepened the despair among Republican leaders. Visiting the capital, a man named Edward Ross reported that, quote, "disappointment was visible in every face present," end quote, especially among the secretary, on the part of the Secretary of the Treasury. Ross noted, quote, "Mr. Dallas declared at the impulse of the moment to all present that he had flattered himself with a peace, but now he gave up the country for utterly lost." So this raises 2 questions. Was Madison to blame for creating this crisis? And how well did he respond to that crisis? Now, the general orthodoxy in the literature is that Madison was a brilliant political thinker, largely responsible for the federal Constitution and for its finest exposition in the Federalist Papers. But they fault him as a waffling administrator unsuited for executive leadership. For example, Gary Wills praises Madison as, quote, a shrewd constitutionalist, end quote, but derides him as a, quote, hapless commander-in-chief, end quote. Scholarly critics regard Madison as temperamentally unsuited for executive office, as too irresolute. That instead he was a consummate legislator, particularly a behind-the-scenes legislator, who worked well in committees and congresses, crafting legislation, compromises, and constitutions. He was soft-spoken, slightly built, and often in poor health. He lacked presence and charisma and could not command the attention of crowds or troops. His harshest critic, Leonard D. White, concludes, quote, Madison lacked force and driving power and was not endowed with political insight, wisdom, or art. He was not meant to be a leader of men, but rather an expounder and student of constitutional forms, end quote. According to this view, Madison was neither a Washington nor a Jackson. And of course, he was no Jack Ryan. He seemed too bookish, too intellectual to perform as the action-adventure figure that so many pop biographies and Hollywood movies now cast as our ideal presidents. Indeed, his taller, brasher, and more popular wife, Dolly Madison, on the right, seems better suited for the idealized presidential role had gender conventions allowed it. And Madison fares relatively poorly with those presidential scholars who pit all the presidents against each other, no matter their generation, in a common race to assess their relative greatness. A great president is supposed to be able, through his charisma, to shape public opinion and move Congress to act. 20th century presidents, especially Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, Ronald Reagan, and the legend of John F. Kennedy, set the paradigm. By comparison, pre-Lincoln presidents appear wanting, save for Jackson and Washington, who look so good on horseback leading men into battle. Now, these rather ahistorical presidential studies represent the great man theory on steroids. For they insist that the public and Congress are inert but malleable. They can only be prodded to do the right things by the proper exercise of executive charisma. Now, this version of the great president now seems like especially wishful thinking in our current time of gridlock. In this vein, we have those surveys of scholars who rank all the presidents on a spectrum that grades them as great, near great, average, mildly disappointing, completely wretched, and James Buchanan. And what's for you, Gary?
Thank you.
Yes. Now, Madison occupies a relatively mediocre rank, generally around 17th or 18th in these surveys. But he only gets that high because he earned extra credit for doing other good things earlier in his life. Now, ranking all presidents on a common scale tends to misassess leaders of earlier generations by standards created long after they had died. My case today is that Madison served as president in a very different country with a very different spin on the Constitution from that partially remade by Abraham Lincoln and fully remodeled by the Roosevelts and their successors in the 20th century. In the early republic, the prevailing construction of the federal Constitution by the governing Republican Party limited national and presidential power. And Madison dutifully accepted and strengthened those limits until they trapped him in the crisis of 1814. During the War of 1812, Madison played his part in the political problem, but ultimately that problem was systemic rather than personal. Had Madison been taller and read fewer books, he still could not have averted the crisis created by almost everyone active in American politics during his generation. The failure was collective. The roots of the crisis lay in the bitter Republican competition with the Federalists for national power during the late 1790s. Led by Jefferson and Madison, the Republicans insisted that the Federalists sought to bolster the executive branch and to centralize national power at the expense of the rights of the states and of individuals. Madison and Jefferson insisted that those Federalist efforts put the nation on the slippery slope to establishing monarchy and aristocracy in America. Now, I think we're very quick to just kind of say, oh, that's just political rhetoric. How could they possibly believe that? But they did believe it. And we have to remember the world they lived in which the United States had relatively recently won a very hard-fought revolution against monarchy and aristocracy, in which monarchy and aristocracy were the norms in the rest of the world, in which the other great republic in the world was the short-lived French Republic, which had collapsed into the military despotism of Bonaparte. So it is quite understandable that people who believed devoutly in the cause of American republicanism would feel that they were largely alone in a dangerous world and that there were enemies within who had to be watched out for, lest they prepare the country to abandon republican forms in favor of more traditional political forms of the British mixed constitution. But having won power on this crusade against power, the Republicans were obligated to adopt certain restrictions. They reduced American taxes pretty substantially. They also cut expenditures, particularly on the military and in particular on the Army. These lower taxes and the smaller federal government proved popular, enabling the Republicans to win more elections by ever wider margins, marginalizing the Federalists and rendering them bitter. And they felt that the day inevitably would come when there would be a crisis and the federal government and the executive branch would be too weak to cope with it, and they could not wait for that crisis to come. And they expected the crisis would bring down the Republican Party as voters would recognize that they would be better off with the Federalists to restore national power. Now, Madison as president then sees a big part of his role to be defined by what he should not do. He needed to defer to his cabinet, that there should be collective decision-making, and he felt that he needed to defer to Congress, that the initiative for most policies should come either from the cabinet or from Congress. He also felt he had to defend civil liberties, and this is the only significant war which the United States has been involved with in which the executive branch did not suspend habeas corpus. And despite the vicious criticism that he received from the Federalists, and the indeed sometimes treasonous behavior by some Federalists, there wasn't a single American who was convicted of treason during this war. So what Madison did not do mattered as much as what he could do as wartime president in his mind. Now, things started to go better for the United States. Well, let me just stay with them. Started to go better for the United States with a couple of modest but significant victories, one's at Baltimore, the other's at Plattsburgh. And this persuaded the British, along with a deteriorating diplomatic situation in Europe, that they needed to get out of the war. So they suddenly offered American negotiators a sweet deal, that if they would just stop talking about impressment and leave it out of the treaty, the British would restore to the United States all the territories that they'd captured. And the British, having won most of the battles in the war up until that point, were occupying eastern Maine, northern Michigan, some islands in Chesapeake Bay, and some islands along the coast of Georgia. So all of that would be returned to the United States. The treaty would be silent on the issues that had started the war, and the two nations would just agree to disagree and go forward. The Americans immediately seized upon this offer because of the desperate condition of their country at home. When the peace treaty arrived in the United States, it sparked an explosion of public celebration. On February 13th in Baltimore, a man reported, quote, "We have just received information of peace. Peace is in everyone's mouth. And although the streets are full of people whose mouths are wide open like snuff boxes, yet they cannot hold their peace, but run about grinning and chattering like so many monkeys." Giddy with relief, Americans celebrated with parades, fireworks, illuminations, toasts, and ringing bells. People felt their country had been rescued from disaster. Now, the Federalists thought, well, surely Americans will see that this peace treaty doesn't resolve any of the issues that the Republicans said they went to war for. But the American people didn't care anymore. Monroe assured the Senate that, quote, "Our Union has gained strength, our troops honor, and the nation character by the contest," end quote. He concluded, "By the war we have acquired a character and a rank among other nations which we did not enjoy before." The Richmond Enquirer, remember the Enquirer? Was the one that just a month before was saying the nation was on the brink of disaster. It reported in February of 1815, quote, "We have waged a war which has covered us with glory," end quote. And then the news of New Orleans arrived just about the same time, and it suddenly did seem like the war was really a glorious thing, and that the United States had won it. This upsets Canadians. Do not tell a Canadian that the United States won the War of 1812, because they're nice people, but they just go off the tracks if you say that. Now, the Federalists couldn't believe their ears when they're hearing all this stuff, because they thought they had the nation on the ropes and the nation was about to throw out the Republicans, and now the Republicans were saying the United States really won this glorious war, and surely the voters will see through this. Well, voters preferred the comforting myth of a glorious war confirmed by an honorable peace. They blamed all the war's difficulties on Federalist obstructionism, and they credited the Republicans with winning the peace. The Federalists crumbled at the polls, even in New England. In 1816, James Monroe easily won the presidency, and the Federalists lost a third of their seats in Congress. They would lose half of the rest of their seats 2 years later. Quote, "Never was there a more glorious opportunity for the Republican Party to place themselves permanently in power," so wrote Joseph Story of the Supreme Court. But now I'm coming to my conclusion, so don't lose hope here. Dearly held illusions have their value, particularly for politicians. They become a political reality as people believe them, and shrewd politicians know how to exploit them. Once freed from the disasters of an unpopular war, James Madison made the most of the popular belief that ultimately he had won it. In his last 2 years in office, Madison became more decisive and successful by embracing measures to increase federal power. In 1815, he sent warships across the Atlantic to defeat the pirates of Algiers in North Africa, winning yet more popularity for the president and the Navy. With the help of Republicans in a newly nationalist mood after 1815, Madison chartered a new national bank, reformed military administration, and expanded the Navy. His administration and Congress embarked on a massive program for constructing frontier and seacoast fortifications to deter future attacks. In another dramatic break with Republican orthodoxy, the federal government adopted a protective tariff to bolster the manufacturing sector that had emerged in the Northeast during the war. For a time, Madison even supported federal expenditures on internal transportation improvements. All of this struck orthodox Republicans as, quote, out-Hamiltoning Alexander Hamilton. Now, Madison had occupied a nationalist position before in his career, before Hamilton had soured him on federal authority, and so in part this is a return to his roots. But this political somersault away from Republican decentralism also benefited from how the Federalists had behaved during the war. Once marginalized from national office, they had abandoned their former and defining commitment to federal power. Instead, they adopted the former Republican positions of enhanced state power, including potential nullification of federal laws and even a right to secede from the Union. Suddenly and utterly discredited by the magical coincidence of peace in New Orleans, the Federalists tainted decentralism as un-American. Now, historians understandably but mistakenly evaluate the War of 1812 in military terms, as the success or failure of armies in battles and campaigns. And they judge Madison the worse for it as an unmilitary president. But a better criterion for evaluating Madison and his war is political. For no war in our history was more thoroughly political than the War of 1812. The Republicans launched that conflict as much to unify themselves and shatter the Federalists as to defeat the British. Battles were the military means to political ends. Half understanding this only, the Federalists expected the Republicans to reap political oblivion for their military failures. What the Federalists missed to their own destruction was that the war ultimately would be won in the nation's newspapers, pamphlets, and polling places. There in 1815 to 1816, the Republicans completed a rout as great as Jackson's over the British at New Orleans. Spinning the peace was even more important than winning the war. A former president, John Adams, recognized Madison's unusual achievement. Quote, "Notwithstanding 1,000 faults and blunders, his administration has acquired more glory and established more union than all three predecessors, Washington, Adams, and Jefferson put together." End quote. Thank you. Here.
As Will explained, Alan and I are just going to talk for a little while here, and I have Will's watch so I know what time it is, and then we'll open the floor to all of you to ask your questions. And as I always say, to ask your questions and not make your speeches, because we don't have a whole lot of time. If you start to make a speech, we'll start to shift and then become rude.
We'll make counter speeches.
We will. We'll make counter speeches.
You don't want academics making counter speeches.
Especially not two of them occupying the same space ever. I want to start by talking about this state rights impulse in New England. So many people think state rights is a Southern thing in United States history, when it's just a thing when somebody who's upset with the federal government deploys, doesn't matter where they are. I'd like to know what Madison's reaction to news from Hartford was. Madison, who of course is implicated in the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, he has a complex resume in some ways. What did he think of the Hartford doings?
Well, his involvement in the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions is something that he finds very embarrassing, and he often has to try to spin that pretty heavily, especially later confronted with nullifiers in the Deep South. But his reaction to New England was initially that the Federalist leaders must surely just be deluding the people, and that the people would see through this pretty quickly. But he became very concerned with the Hartford Convention that maybe, in fact, there was public support in New England and that this would be a greater crisis than he had imagined was possible.
As a follow-up to that, I want you to talk a little bit about senses of loyalty and community in the United States at the time of the War of 1812. Is there a sense of regionalism in New England that's roughly comparable to a sense of Southern slaveholding regionalism in the antebellum years, an identity that is maybe even more important than their American identity?
Right. Well, I think this is one of the ways in which hindsight tends to not always serve us well, in that we sit in a highly successful nation, which is cohesive, And we are pretty confident that there's a unifying American identity. That wasn't clear at all in the early republic. This is a brand new country where there are powerful regional differences in which people don't travel nearly as much as they do today to different regions. People tended overwhelmingly to stay in the region in which they were born. If they didn't stay there, they were moving west, and when they did move west, they were unlikely ever to go back east again. Transportation and communication were just very primitive and difficult.
And in some ways took their region with them when they went west.
Sometimes.
Some of the characteristics.
So the West was settled by people from Virginia or people from North Carolina, South Carolina is a different West from that settled by New Englanders. The United States of this period is largely a coalition of regions in which the leaders don't entirely trust each other. And this was evident in how the wars fought. There has to be a campaign against Detroit to satisfy the Westerners. The New Yorkers have to be satisfied with their own campaign to go up against Montreal. The New Englanders you don't have to care about because they're not supporting the war anyway. You have to defend the South against coastal attacks and against the escape of their own slaves. So it ends up lots of decisions are made, including the delegation sent to Ghent. You had to have Henry Clay to represent Kentucky. You had to have John Quincy Adams to represent New England. You had to have Gallatin to represent the Atlantic states.
And different levels of conviviality.
Yes, yes. I mean, Henry Clay is playing cards and drinking heavily throughout the negotiations.
Pulling his oar, yes.
And John Quincy Adams was pretty outraged at all of this.
Being an Adams.
Yes.
And doing what they do. Do you think that you talked about the possibility, you think a significant possibility that secession might actually have unfolded had the military campaigns not gone the way they went?
Well, if peace had not erupted is the key thing.
What you didn't touch on, you touched on it a little bit. Talk about the performance of the militia and how there was a local or state character to that and how it reacted.
Okay, so we're going for comedy now, yes. Okay.
It's very hurtful for you to say that to people who love the militia,
right.
Alan.
I'm sorry.
As Americans did. They always loved the militia.
Yes, they did. They loved the militia. And the militia is great on the 4th of July. That's their peak performance in this period because they parade around. As long as they have blanks in their guns, nobody gets hurt. The militia ordinarily met once a year for a single day. Most of them, in fact, did not own guns. They don't really want to pay a whole lot of attention to their officers, whom in many cases they have elected. The campaign platforms for most people running to be a militia officer were, I can buy you more drinks than the other guy. So if the war could have been settled by a drinking competition, the militia would have won. And the militia often, because the United States is so shorthanded for regular troops, they have to call up militia units, send them to the front, shepherd them toward the front lines, and say, let's go, we're going to invade Canada. And a lot of the militiamen would then sit down and say, no, I just looked at the U.S. Constitution, and I am not obligated as a state militiaman to cross an international boundary. And even men who were staunch Republicans, voting for Madison, voting for war, they were gung-ho for somebody else to fight it, and they didn't want to cross the border. And that's one of the primary reasons I showed you the Battle of Queenston Heights. Several thousand American militiamen refused to cross the river to come to the rescue of the regular soldiers who were beleaguered and ended up being captured.
So having said that, let's talk about the American fascination with the idea of the citizen soldier who leaves his plow to pick up a musket, this deep antipathy toward a regular army, a professional army, as inimical to small r republicanism. Does this catastrophically bad performance on the part of the militia during the war lead to a significant change in attitudes toward a professional military establishment?
It does. And hence you have Congress voting for an expansion of the Navy after the war that's unprecedented, particularly for peacetime in the United States, up until that point. You also have West Point has expanded pretty dramatically. So the officer corps that you know so well from the Civil War is really trained by this expanded West Point, which comes out of the fact that several of the officers trained at West Point had done so well in the war. So there is a persuasion that lingers that the United States needs a more professional military and especially a more professional officer corps than it had had during the War of 1812.
And the greatest hero who emerges from the war is
Jackson.
Military heroes, Andrew Jackson.
Yeah.
And what part of his command gets greatest credit for the victory at New Orleans?
Well, again, if it's in popular memory, it's that these Kentucky and Tennessee riflemen won the battle, and the reality is that it's a professional American artillery that won the battle that inflicted most of the casualties on British forces. So there's this constant interplay. We like to believe that it's the amateurs who win American wars, but that's not often the reality.
Even a tendency sometimes to cast Jackson as an amateur, when of course he wasn't.
He wasn't.
He was a soldier. And
He had long experience in the militia. He hated the militia. He hung
all
a lot of
officers hate the militia.
Right. He hung a fair number of them because they would desert.
He was a direct man.
He was, yes.
If you said mean things about his wife, he might shoot you.
Well, he did shoot you.
A dangerous
if you said
man.
that, yes.
Politics aren't nearly as
Right.
dangerous as they were in the early republic.
Well, what was it? Zell Miller challenged some journalist to a duel, and the journalist didn't know what to make of it.
I don't want to take all the rest of our time, although I'm inclined to take all the rest of our time. I'm going to open the floor, but reserve the right to shut it down again if I feel like it, so that I can ask Alan some questions that I would like for him to address. So if someone has something you would like to bring up, the microphone beckons. It has a red light, which I can see from up here. If you'll give your question, Alan will do something with it.
Maybe refer it to you.
Yes, right. I thought that was a question. It was a departure. And another.
I needed either to say more or fewer controversial things about Madison.
I'm just going to grab the microphone because I'm the only person that gets to ask a question from up here, and Barbara Perry will have a second question. I have two for you. What were the alternatives in 1812 to war?
Right.
So that's, I don't know this period terribly well, but you described but this was a very bad decision. The United States was not ready for war, and it was drawn into war out of emotional reasons rather than a careful deliberation. And maybe you could just talk about roads not taken. Second, I want to pick up on Gary's point about war in the American historical experience. You painted a picture of a president who was instinctively a small government person, who believed in restraint and who practiced restraint, found himself at war, and then suddenly fell in love with the idea of a powerful government. Is that a common pattern in American life? Can you talk a little bit about the way in which war has had a dramatic impact on the shaping of the American nation over the last couple of centuries? Thanks.
Take up to 2 minutes. That's a sort of broad question.
Do I get 2 minutes for each question?
Yeah, you can have 2 minutes.
Just for the two. Okay, the alternative, in 1806, James Monroe was sent over to Britain to negotiate these issues. And he got major British concessions on the issue of the blockade. But he did not get a concession on impressment. So he decided, well, he had a colleague, William Pinckney, along. The two of them decided this was the best deal the United States was ever going to get, and that it was better than war. So he concluded that treaty. Now, it's with all treaties, it's provisional until it's ratified by the Senate and signed by the President. Comes back to Thomas Jefferson, who was the President, and his Secretary of State, James Madison, and they said, not good enough, because it doesn't deal with impressment. And because of that, we're going to reject this treaty. We're not even going to submit it to the Senate. This was very embarrassing to Monroe. And it's, I believe, a lost opportunity. Now, I understand the grievance of impressment, but if you're really serious about waging a war over impressment, then the United States needed to build a couple of hundred warships at an immense cost. And they were not prepared to do that. They thought they could instead wage a war on the cheap, without a professional army, with a very small navy, by invading Canada. And even if they had invaded Canada and conquered it and used it as a bargaining chip, they would have seen the British just shrug their shoulders, because Canada, if they had a list of colonies in terms of priority to the British Empire, it's like 142nd on the list somewhere. The British aren't going to cave on a major issue to them just to get Canada back. So it's a false analysis. So it's not entirely satisfactory to a staunch nationalist position, but the best deal the United States was going to get, short of war, was the Monroe-Pinckney Treaty, and it was a pretty good deal given the circumstances of a relatively weak country. And I believe the United States should have, the Jefferson administration should have embraced that.
Alan, how much did the Chesapeake Leopard affair up the ante in terms of feeling humiliated and not a real nation in a...
Right. That certainly ups the ante. This is an episode where a British warship stops an American warship, demands to inspect its crew for deserters. The American captain refused to allow that, figured he could just sail on, but the British opened fire and killed 3 American sailors, wounded, I think, about 15 others. This American captain had to surrender his ship. The British boarded it, and they took off 5 men who were considered deserters. This caused outrage. You could say the other alternative would be to have declared war in 1807 right after this, because at that point the Federalists were outraged, and you would have had a united country unprepared for war, but a united country that would, in theory, have made the sacrifices necessary to build up the army and wage this war. So that's a second missed opportunity. The other is that, what's the alternative policy? It's the embargo, which is to shut down all international commerce by the United States. Can you imagine if a president today announced that there would be no international commerce, that all planes and ships are going to be grounded, and just what kind of economic crisis that would create? Well, in this more simple economy and technology, it caused a sufficiently big crisis.
Especially in New England.
Especially in New England. And it is the failure of the embargo that it compounds the embarrassment and leads them to say, we tried everything. We tried diplomacy, we tried the embargo, both have failed. Policy we're left with, war. Now, you had another question, which was about presidents being tempted by power in wartime, I think. Is that it?
The place of war in American history.
Okay. Okay. I would say that just about all of the major policy transformations in American history have come, with the exception of the Depression, have come during and immediately after war, because war has compelled the federal government to assume much greater responsibility. And in past wars, they have mobilized so much of the American male population that people expected that coming out of this war there would be some sort of expansion of benefits for a broader public than was the case before the war. So I would say certainly during and after the Civil War is a great expansion of federal ambition. The World War I, the same way. Some then backsliding during the 1920s. Depression, in effect, is a kind of crisis that's like war in this country. And then World War II.
I mean, the Civil War we got what we would consider basic veterans benefits came out of the Civil War, pensions and pensions.
You got paper money, national currency and paper money. You got the first income tax.
You got conscription.
You got conscription. You had the Homestead Act. You had the Morrill Act, which provides federal funding for higher education.
The Morrill Act and the GI Bill of Rights are probably the 2 most important pieces of educational legislation in our history, both directly
and greatly expanded the number of people and the type of people who could go get a university education.
We're going to stop this now for a minute and let you ask your question.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being here in this auspicious week for you. And those of us who are at the Miller Center on the faculty are really looking forward to working with you when you arrive in Charlottesville officially. So I have two quick questions. One is, how do British historians cover this war? And second, I've read quite a bit about the history of the White House, and I'm intrigued by the historians who point to the War of 1812, the burning down of the White House, but the decision to build it back up. And that is then, in some minds, the kickoff for making that building, that edifice, the center point of presidential power.
Okay. Thank you very much. Let me deal with the White House question first. There's major incentive in Congress to relocate the national capital after this disaster. And this is seriously proposed because the congressmen were very unhappy. If you take a group of congressmen who are used to a certain level of comfort and you force them into cramped quarters and temporary, and then a lot of them are going to be upset, particularly those who have come from more comfortable places like Philadelphia or New York. So they seriously pushed to relocate the national capital. And this was one of the things where Madison really dug in his heels. He generally liked to go along with what Congress wanted to do, but this was a case where he used his influence over Congress to say, this is not going to happen. And he was successful. Now, I'm sorry, I've forgotten the first part of your question, the first question. How did British historians... Oh, that's easy. They say, what war? Right? Okay, but Canadian historians are different. Canadian historians love the War of 1812 because they're persuaded they won. Right? So they write very different books than American historians tend to write about the War of 1812. And British historians say there was much more important business. Lord Nelson, Trafalgar, Lord Wellington, Waterloo, that's the important stuff for them. And almost no one in Britain knows there was a War of 1812.
Relatively, it's tiny in terms of the number of British resources. It's just...
In a single Napoleonic battle, more people died than an entire War of 1812.
By far, yeah.
You know, they're massive armies in Europe at these times, hundreds of thousands of men in combat. Napoleon had an army of about 1 million men, which is extraordinary for that, the logistical challenge of that. There's nothing, largest American military force in the War of 1812 that they could assemble all in one place at one time and more or less keep fed 6,000 men.
That's right. Even by Revolutionary War standards,
it's
very
smaller than Washington's army.
Considerably smaller. But for the Canadians, it's their war.
It's their war.
Did curling come out of the war for the Canadians, I wonder?
You know, you have stumped me, Gary.
I know that there are people, including a number of graduate students whom I'll put on the spot in our ancillary room, and you have free reign of the microphone as well. You are not second-class citizens out there in the other room, should you still be there. You're welcome to come in and ask. If no one steps up, however, I have another place I want to go. I find it hard to believe there are no other questions.
I know there are other
questions.
questions.
There we go. Step up. Save the reputation of this group.
Maybe not. I think from your accent and the Red Sox, you can say a little bit about the Penobscot expedition as being a pretty good example of the fiasco of the states carrying.
I never expected at UVA somebody would ask me about the Penobscot expedition. Are you
I'm from Waltham.
Okay. Okay. The Penobscot expedition is there's one in the Revolution and then there's one in the War of 1812 where the British want to improve Canada's security, and they think one of the ways to do that is to grab Eastern Maine. So they grab Eastern Maine, and they fortify Castine. And one of the consequences of this is that it inspires so much smuggling, just massive smuggling, because now it's so much easier for the New Englanders to trade because there's a British port that's just on the other side of Penobscot Bay. And it's just thousands of dollars. The leading entrepot in the world became Castine, Maine for a brief period of time. And the British collected massive customs revenue from that. So what happens to this money at the end of the war? They take it to Halifax and they give it to endow Dalhousie University, which is created out of this customs fund from American smuggling during the War of 1812.
Just like wars which often rage out of control, discussions take us places we never would have anticipated. And that was one of them. Yes.
Good afternoon. An interpretive guide here at Ashland Highland, James Monroe's home nearby, near Monticello. So question, you discussed James Monroe as being simultaneously Secretary of State and Secretary of War after John Armstrong was forced out. Could you please address a little bit of James Monroe's role in these two roles he played, as well as then leading up to his presidency, any power and developing astuteness there? And thank you.
It was very awkward for Monroe to join Madison's cabinet because he felt that Madison and Jefferson had left him out to dry by rejecting his treaty. And there were all sorts of letters that had to be exchanged to smooth relations so that Monroe could feel that he would be trusted as Secretary of State. And he felt that as Secretary of State, that he should be in the next position to become the next president, because that had become the tradition because Madison had succeeded Jefferson. And it's kind of with that understanding that Monroe joins the cabinet. And then he found himself in this bitter rivalry with another member of the cabinet, which is Armstrong, the Secretary of War. So they spent much of their time undermining one another. And Monroe turns out to be a lot better at it because Monroe was a much shrewder politician than Armstrong was. And Armstrong then takes the fall, and Monroe takes over the two roles. The war seems to end gloriously at the very end, and Monroe basks in the glory and is elected in 1816 almost by acclamation in the country.
I have a question that kind of follows up on that, and it has to do, you're sort of judged by the people who you put or place around you. I'd love your thoughts about, was Madison a good judge of character, and how did his cabinet change over the course of his two presidencies?
Madison, it's a tough question to answer because you'd look at Madison's cabinet choices, and you would say, not so good. But they're not always what we would call choices. I mean, somebody chooses a member of the cabinet not simply for the merits of the person, but also for the politics involved. And Madison is trying to preside over this very fractured, factionalized Republican Party in a country which is riven by regional jealousies. And he has to balance that all out by who he picks to put in the cabinet. And the pool from New England is particularly weak. So he has to have a couple of New Englanders in there, even though they're not up to the job. He's picking some Pennsylvania Republican, which means that he's going to piss off the other Republicans from Pennsylvania. He needs somebody from the South, but probably not from Virginia unless he's desperate for somebody to be Secretary of State, and then it's Monroe. So Monroe is, I would, except for Gallatin, who is a holdover, is a very competent man, but who is somebody that at least half of the political establishment hates. He's in a tough spot. What I would say is that by the end of his second term, he's got a much more congenial cabinet, and on balance, there's a better set of talents than there was at the start.
Because of where we are, I'm going to ask you a question related to Thomas Jefferson, and that is, did he communicate with Madison over any of the war-related issues? Did he judge Madison in ways that Madison either did or didn't find out about? What was Jefferson's place in all of this?
Jefferson is very loyal to Madison. And Jefferson writes early and often and very full letters, very encouraging letters. And he basically sees his role to try to kind of buck up Madison, who is enduring these horrific developments. He does have some financial suggestions in the last year of the war that are, let's just say, not helpful. And
His embargo had been such a success.
well, the dirty secret is that Madison was the prime mover behind the
I'd rather
embargo.
blame Jefferson.
Okay. It's a kind of a joint operation between Madison. So that was a colossal mistake. And that's a case in which they violated their own convictions, which were to keep the federal government small and weak. To have a federal government that's committed to criminalizing international trade is remarkable.
And using troops.
And
to
using
enforce
troops,
it, which they allegedly
using
don't
federal
like either.
troops and they engaged in pitched battles in some cases up on the border of Vermont and northern New York with Canada. Jefferson was very loyal, very supportive, provided some policy suggestions that were less than useful, but Madison becomes much better over time of filtering what he's getting from Jefferson to maximize what's going to be useful and to set aside what's not.
Yes.
You said that late in 1814, peace negotiations were going very badly because the British were demanding so much, and our negotiators were at each other's throats. What happened so quickly to change it and bring peace about?
Right. Well, there are two developments. One is these American military victories at Plattsburgh and Baltimore halt the British momentum and gives the British pause. Now, the British had been waging war almost continuously since 1793. And it had been enormously expensive. And the tax burden on the British taxpayers was unprecedented for the early modern period. And a lot of people just wanted their taxes to go down. They wanted the war to be over. So there's big popular support for the war against the United States as payback time for what they saw as the Americans stabbing them in the back when Napoleon was riding high and Britain was in its weakest spot. So they're eager to stick it to the Americans until they start losing battles. And then it turns out that this enthusiasm by the British public for the war in the United States turns out to be awfully thin. Also, there's a diplomatic crisis in Europe at the Congress of Vienna, which was meeting different foreign ministers from the different European nations, trying to hash out how they were going to rearrange Europe in the wake of Napoleon's fall. Well, it turns out they were starting to be at each other's throats about this. And so British political leaders say, we may have another blow up in Europe. And we better get our troops, who are over in North America, back on this side of the Atlantic. So they sent the directions to their negotiators at Ghent. This is the deal you should offer the Americans so we can get out of this war right now. And it turns out it was very astute because they didn't realize this was going to happen. But Napoleon escapes from the island of Elba in the spring, lands in France. France, most of the French people rally to Napoleon, and there's a new war on. It's not the war they'd expected, but there is the war. They did expect a war, and they get one in the summer of 1815. And it's a good thing that they'd brought back a lot of their troops from North America.
On your Madison slide, you had two Madisons up there. The Madison on the right, what was a big attraction between the two? You've kind of painted James as being less than manly. And along with that, what role did she play in all of these decisions?
Well, almost everyone thought that when it came to the politics of human interaction, that Dolly was a superstar. And she helped to break the ice in lots of circumstances. She was celebrated as probably the first great Washington hostess and was an enormous political asset for her husband. She was much younger. She's very charming. She's very clever. She was extremely attractive. She was a widow, and James Madison was much older. And a lot of people were very surprised by the match because James Madison is shorter, his health wasn't that great, and he was reading all these books all the time. But you know, Madison was a powerful intellect and was a very decent man in his relationships with his family, and a very well-intentioned man. So there were these sterling qualities that Dolly recognized in him, and frankly, she warmed to the notion of being a prominent man's wife and the kind of stage it offered for her to exercise some influence. And she really cherished that, and she made the most of it.
Yes, sir. I'm curious to know what the role of Sackett's Harbor, New York, played in the War of 1812. And it was my understanding that the Department of the Navy was headquartered there at some point of the War of 1812. And there was an incursion from Sackett's Harbor to Toronto that resulted in the British coming to Washington, D.C. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, technically, the Secretary of the Navy always remained at the national capital. But the largest American naval base in the world was Sackett's Harbor, New York, on Lake Ontario during the War of 1812. The largest American warship, mounting over 100 cannon, was built during the War of 1812 on Lake Ontario. So, and there's no way for that ship to ever get to the Atlantic. So it's one of the more absurd dimensions of this war that has plenty of absurdity, that so much of the American Navy is newly built on a lake. But they have to control that lake if they're going to invade the province of Upper Canada and maintain that. Because logistically, you can't move things by land at that time, given the technology and the crude roads. It's not like the Civil War where you're moving men and equipment and provisions by railroad, and railroads are essential. Well, controlling waterways is essential in this war, and that's why Lake Ontario becomes the scene in which the two powers are building warships trying to outclass the other. But what would happen is once the Americans built a bigger ship, the British would go into their port at Kingston and refuse to come out and fight. And they would sit and they would build a new warship even bigger than the American warship. And it would come out and the Americans would go back into Sackett's Harbor. There are a very few windows in which the American Navy has the initiative on Lake Ontario. And one of them was in April 1813. And that's when they were able to cross the lake and grab York, which is now called Toronto, which was the capital of Upper Canada. In the course of doing it, their soldiers got out of control in plundering the town, and they burned several buildings, not the whole town, but they burned the Parliament buildings of Upper Canada. And this was one, but not the only, atrocity committed by American troops that the British cited to justify what they did in Washington, D.C. in 1814.
The lakes remained important. The first iron-clad vessel that the United States Navy ever built was also built on the lakes rather than to be ocean-going. It was begun in the 1840s, long before the more famous ones that came later. Yes?
But Plattsburgh, New York, is yet on a different lake. That's on Lake Champlain. So there were two lakes involved. Lake
Three.
Ontario and Lake
There's Lake Erie.
Lake Erie.
So they're building
excuse me,
separate
yes,
flotillas
yes,
on these three lakes that don't communicate with each other.
But Lake Champlain became so important. Can you comment on that and how that battle was so decisive?
Well, I mentioned there were several British invasions in late 1814 into the United States, and one of them is coming from Montreal, and it's ascending Lake Champlain. It's an army on land, and then it's a flotilla to support them in the lake, because they cannot afford not to control the lake, because then the Americans could go and interfere with their logistics. So they have to work together. And they think they've got the American forces trapped in Plattsburgh, and then the British commander overplayed his hand by telling the British flotilla not to just blockade, but to go into the harbor to destroy the American flotilla. And that was a colossal mistake, because the flotilla that gets destroyed is the British. And then the British Army commander, even though he had an overwhelming superiority, decides that it would be pointless for him to storm the American lines, even though in all likelihood it would have won. because he felt it would have been a hollow victory to have captured Plattsburgh if he has lost the ability to protect his supply lines with the loss of the lake. And so he withdrew his army. And that is very embarrassing, and this British military commander gets ultimately recalled in disgrace for it.
Something very similar had happened in the Revolution at Valcour Island. I mean, the same kind of, that water route, the Hudson and Lake George and Lake Champlain and the Richelieu River, that is a very heavily used avenue of advance for the logistical reasons that Alan has mentioned, from the colonial wars through the Revolution to the War of 1812. Campaign after campaign went up and down. We have time for one more question, and here it comes.
Thank you. It was most informative. I think everyone would think so. Two statements. One, correct me if I'm wrong, James Madison was the only president who got on a horse and rode into battle. I think he left the office when he knew the British were coming.
You mean while being president? You mean while being
While
president?
president.
Okay, because
Well, anyway, that's
there were a whole
sort of
set
interesting
of them
fact
from the
that
Civil War.
I think he had more business than we might think. But here's my question. You mentioned political factors that influenced the war, and then the people themselves. I'm curious about economic factors. For instance, the Federalists were very caught up in their own economy in New England. But what are some economic factors that might have influenced the thinking?
Okay, those are two very good questions. Technically, Madison didn't go into battle as president. He went to a battlefield that was being prepared for battle, Blandensburg, consulted with the commander on the spot, and then when British forces approached, he did the right thing and got out of harm's way. Now, as for the economic considerations, the United States was enjoying an economic boom that was largely driven by international trade, in which they were exploiting their position as a neutral nation in a world at war. They can carry cargoes that are unsafe for the belligerents. The French are attacking the British, and the British are attacking the French, and the Americans are a neutral country. So they pick up all these cargoes, and the United States merchant marine just booms in this period. That's one of the reasons why so many British sailors are trying to get out of Britain and come to the United States to work on these American merchant ships. And if you go to places like Baltimore or Boston, and you can see these merchants, nice houses, and a lot of them are built in this period from essentially 1790, the first decade of the 19th century. So it's a boom in the seaports. It's a boom for farmers whose crops are being exported in part to the West Indies to pick up this French colonial produce that's then carried. So this is called re-export trade. And the American economy is growing rich on it. And then the British start meddling with it. And so this lies behind why Americans are so upset with the British trying to impose a blockade on Europe and are meddling with American ships in order to reclaim sailors. So it's a powerful economic interest. And the South is often said, well, why is it that New England, which is dedicated to shipping, is opposed to the war, and the South, which doesn't have so much shipping, is so gung-ho for it? Well, that's a little simplistic in that there was a lot of shipping from the middle Atlantic states, and they were gung-ho for the war. New England shippers had gotten used to the costs of doing business, included an occasional ship being confiscated and crews being picked up, and they were willing to bear that cost rather than risk a war which would entirely, potentially, shut down their trade. The South is becoming big at that time in the export of cotton. And the British blockade is hurting their exports of cotton. And that's one of many considerations that leads Southern congressmen to overwhelmingly support the war.
Thank you very much, Alan.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.